Get 30% shorter average wait time when you buy and book online at discounttire.com. Discount Tire. Let's get you taken care of.
Hi there, I am Adem Kirbas from Ordu. This is in Turkey. I hope you are all doing well in this pandemic, and that all of you take care of yourselves. Now it is summer, and now everyone is flocking the streets. Now you will have to be probably more careful than before. However, today in my episode, I wanna talk about the developments between of baby boomers, and then in partially compared them to the millennials. The millennials I wanna talk about in the next episode, but I've to some sort of conclude the backdrop of how thinking came about, or what cultural implications and social conditions we need to consider to understand the present social backdrop as well. And why millennials? I mean, this would be rather easier to just point out the backdrop of millennials. This is true, of course, indeed, but nevertheless, many millennials had baby boomers as parents, and this is so they rose children in their world perspective, and this is something we need to consider, because your parents partially help you to, or not only partially, but in your formative years as a child, your parents, the society you grow up in is some sort of your lens into the world, how you see, and how you see things, to what you attribute wealth, value, and so on and so forth. So the millennial or the baby boomer era is something you could roughly start with the end of World War II, and I will give a short and very brief summary of history, so that we are all at the same page. I mean, important of all is after World War II, Europe was destroyed. I mean, Europe was the leading power up to that point. Europe dominated the world. European imperialism stretched from the Americas to Asia, Africa, and after the Second World War, Europe pretty much destroys itself. America emerges as the sole superpower next to the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union, of course, had paid a high toll during the World War, and not as well as not only during those two world wars, but as well as through the communist revolution and whatsoever. So everyone who thinks that communism worked in Russia, of course, needs to take into consideration the conditions Russia went through, and one of or a couple of these things are, for example, that even to this very day, Russia, and back then the Soviet Union, was a very vast country with a lot of resources. This is true for Russia to this very day, and despite the fact that it was such a vast country, it was somehow underpopulated. Russia today has only about 200 million inhabitants, and most of these inhabitants live at the western side of the Ural mountain range, and only to comparison, I mean, those who know a little bit of geography, Germany has 80 million inhabitants, and it is way smaller than Russia. So Russia has at best about 2.5 times of the inhabitants of Germany, or and for this 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 country is vastly underpopulated. This means there are a lot of resources which can be used by many few people, and in the Soviet Union the population was even fewer, despite because after the First World War, Russia lost a lot of casualties. Then in the Civil War, there were a lot of famine, there were a lot of destruction, and then with Stalinistic terror, the the famous gulags, which pretty much destroyed every life, or a lot of families, as well as the prosecution of intellectual. And then the Second World War, again, Russia paid the highest tolls within the Second World War. So to say it blatantly, the reason why communism worked in Russia was actually because the country was vastly underpopulated. A lot of people died, and there were plenty of resources, and this is the reason why actually, and this is something one has to look into details, but this is the reason why the economic system in Russia actually worked. This was and this is the only reason, and this is the reason why in other parts of the world where this economic system was tried, it did not work, because in order for communism to work, you have to live in abundance of resources. However, but America somehow evolved as the dominating power in Europe. It had nothing of its glory, but the war pretty much it was somehow perceived that the civilized countries of the world, that they destroy each other, and so it came to that. I mean, then of course this Pax Americana began. This is some sort of a peace. The American dominance in the West. This lasted from the end of the World War II to 9/11, and later on to the invasion of Iraq, of Afghanistan and Iraq, and then this war on terror. One might can say that this was pretty much the end of the American domination of the world, especially those that the Americans could not subjugate Iraq, could not bring peace about, and that even to this very day the Middle East is crumbling. It is a lot of infectious movements and thoughts derived from this area, and they are pestering the world to this very day. But what was different, of course, this is something you have to think about and ask about as well, because before the Americans, the Brits ruled the world, the Pax Britannica. This lasted roughly the century. It started after at the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and lasted to the eve of the First World War. In the First World War, you could somehow say that this British world dominance started to crumble. The war took a high toll. I mean, they could maintain their colonies after the First World War, but it was pretty much the end of British rule. But one thing, or one of the reasons where Americans were different, of course, were the Americans always some sort of flattered themselves to bring peace and freedom to the world. I mean, the Europeans did the same. I mean, when America, for example, went into Vietnam, of course they wanted to set publicly, and they as well as believed it, that they want to bring in peace and democracy and freedom. This is actually what the European powers said as well. For example, before Africa was invaded and colonialized by Europeans, the common notion was that European powers would go into Africa, would make Africa a second Europe, and some sort of make up for slavery and so on. But this was not the case. This was rather sweet words to conceal the real intention, and this was, of course, to exploit Africa. Africa was rich of resources. Africa in that part, especially Northern Africa, was in the hands of the Ottoman Empire, but then the Ottoman Empire crumbled, they lost power, and as Africa was somehow free for the grabbing, and this is how the European powers then went in, and this is again to bring about peace and liberty. I mean, of course, you see this politics with Theodore Roosevelt, and he somehow was the you could say before Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, some sort of a rather this approach to this on this world stage, that every country should be able to rule itself. I mean, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, excuse me, did not succeed. He wasn't re-elected, and Theodore Roosevelt shortly in 1945 died. However, the Americans, you could say, they were somehow not as ruthless as the Europeans. I mean, for European powers, especially, this was true for the French, as well as for the Brits and the German. The mainly cause was, or the mainly reason to have to interfere in the businesses of other countries was the grab of land. Great Britain conquered India. It was rather from the economical purpose. Nevertheless, European colonialism was always built on conquest, whereas Americans, they rather wanted to create new markets. And of course, you have to be aware of one thing, and this was that the communist societies, that they were not integrated into the world stage. There was a thriving black market. One famous example is in Eastern Germany, but nevertheless, those communist countries were not integrated. These two, and Americans, of course, wanted to create new markets where they can sell their products. One of the reasons why the Marshall Plan was actually taken into action was actually that in America people feared that when Europe is lost to communism, then you have no one to buy your products. I mean, it was not the sole reason, but one of the reasons was actually that you have a market to distribute your stuff. And American and the leading role of American, despite the fact that Americans to this very day invest a lot of money in the military and so on, but it was rather about, you could say, cohesion into this capitalistic system. It was not like the European colonial powers who pretty much invaded every country they could invade and somehow dictated their terms on it. This was a very good example. Is Great Britain in the Opium Wars. They pretty much invaded or conquered parts of parts of China for the sole reason because China wanted to ban the opium trade, and Great Britain would have lost out a lot of income because of that. So Americans, the American, you could say the role in the world stage was rather some sort of cohesion, but as well as a force. I mean, don't get me wrong, the Vietnam War as well as this war in South Korea. This was with force and with violence, but nevertheless, it was the difference to the Europeans was of course that the main reason was that you wanted to bring these countries together, integrate them into your economic system. But of course, you have to be aware of one thing, and this is what I talked about in the past, and this is that America, compared to Europe, had a way more different, had a civil society. I mean, the European powers, when they invaded different countries around the world, they did not have to, or they didn't have to deal with a free press, which would immediately chide them. So European powers somehow had free hand in those conquests, whereas in America, this is a lot of literature is already and was written about it, had a very thriving civil society, and America's involvement in the world was always never really wanted by the American population, and then it was rather the destruction of Europe and, of course, economic interests, because one could really assume that the Soviets and the communist systems would ban American goods from the markets which they have, despite the fact that there was a black market, and the communist authorities knew about these black markets, and they now somehow did not squelch it. However, but it was closed. And of course, you have to be aware of one thing, that the American role in the world stage was somehow ambiguous. Ambiguous in that sense that Americans wanted to wanted to be perceived as non-Europeans, as some sort of people who are indeed interested in liberating people, but their action were in some instances violence, but violence which was not as ruthless as European imperialism, because they couldn't go so far. And I'm talking about really atrocities when one only has to think and remember what the Brits did in India, or the French in Indochina. I mean, this was brutal. This was brutal suppression of any dissent. The Americans, they were not willing to go that far. They couldn't go so far. So it was, in a way, always this American role was always some sort of ambiguous, and they were perceived as ambiguous. And in the end, this is what you saw then in the Vietnam War. The Americans, they were not seen much different than the European imperialists who came and invaded this country and wanted to exploit its people. But this would go, of course, too far. What we want to come back to Europe, and this is that Europe, after the Second World War, became some sort of a buffer zone between the Soviet East, the Communist East, and the American West. Europe became some sort of apolitical. they in a way secluded themselves entirely or partly from the world stage, with Great Britain still playing a role in it. But after all, Europe somehow surrendered their foreign policy to America. And this was kind of the cultural backdrop of the baby boomers. So that the understanding of the baby boomers, or self-understanding of the baby boomers, was of course a bit different than the generations before them, because before those two world wars, those generation, this great generation, how it is sometimes called, they had a different self-understanding from the world. They thought that Europe is the center of the world, it's the center of culture and everything, so that the world, the sun rises in Europe and sets in Europe. This was some sort of the perception of the average European. America back then was considered the backwaters. People in Europe looked with disdain at America, and America did not play a crucial role in this world. But this then changes of course. But one thing we have to clear, and this is the term baby boomer. I mean, like I said, I am talking from an Austrian, from Austro-German perspective, and baby boomers is a very common term in the English language, but in German, this generation is called 68er Bewegung. 68 is 68 movement. This has to do of course with those 5 years between 1965 and 1970, where all this upheaval was, which we will come to talk about in shortly. And somehow this is this difference in Europe, and besides Europe being apolitical, of course, Europe after the Second World War tried to unify itself. These are the first steps of the European Union, which later took shape, and then with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the European Union, no matter whether people like it or not, some sort of has become a means for survival. I mean, without the European Union, Europe would probably not survive the economic onslaught of China. There is no way. So the European Union has become some sort of a golden cage. Everyone threatens to leave it, but in the end, we all stay inside, because we know that outside, those ravenous beasts, they would not hesitate a moment to eat us. However, and of course, the Vietnam War had a huge impact on the American psyche as well as American development, and this Vietnam War does not play a crucial role in Europe. This anti-war movement. There were, of course, indeed an anti-war movement in Europe, but this was in Germany. This was rather for German unification and so on. But this was not that. It would not go so far as in America, where the Vietnam War, you could say, was the crucial incident in the era, or in the generation of baby boomers. You could compare it to the millennials. For the millennials, the decisive or significant incident was 9/11. So, and it became important, and everything that came with 9/11 then, even to this very day, is part of our thinking. I mean, the baby boomers, they were indeed a very important generation. I mean, to think about the second wave of feminism, and as far as me concerned, the second wave of feminism is still unmatched, unrivaled, given that the third wave of feminism, some sort of lost themselves in a mystical in the mystical mud of cultural appropriation and taking immediately offense. However, the generation, or especially in Europe, the baby boomer generation, they were indeed remarkable in some instances. This was in philosophy. Think about French philosophy. The French philosophy. There were many philosophical thought schools who to this very day play a crucial role in the understanding of the world and how we interpret the world. Think of structuralism, post-structuralism. Many philosophers from this age are still one of those philosophers and thinkers who are cited the most. Think about Foucault, Bourdieu, mostly French philosophers. And of course, one thing what is very important in for baby boomers was actually this sexual emancipation. This was a crucial part of it. This had to do, the place where this all started was the university. The university was indeed some sort of back then. You have to be aware there was no internet, no Google whatsoever. Universities were some sort of the center of all information, and this development started in the university because most of the baby boomers came from the middle classes, and back then the universities this is partially true still today. The universities somehow generate the leading elite in a country. This has changed a little bit, but this is true as well. And these were who then had very influence, and this sexual emancipation actually started earlier. It's at way earlier. It already started with the working class, but like we talked previously about significant transformation, it did not reach or had no effect. This sexual emancipation of the woman had no real effect before it was then taken over by baby boomers in those universities, and then from those universities was then it spread into the top loges of the society, and this is one part of the significant transformation. What we said is important because change for your own means nothing if it can't change the society or contribute to change within the society. And of course, very interesting is the difference today. Back in the days when those baby boomers came, they had to conquer these institutions, the university, as well as then the television and literature. If you think about those three places of power, and you can say these places are the control of human conscience. These are television, literature, and the educational system. Everyone who controls these three aspects of a society controls what is being reported, how it is being reported, what do children learn, what they are being taught about, and how they are being brought up. These three branches in the institution. Today, of course, with the internet, this has changed, but to this very day, television or entertainment, to say it more broadly, as well as literature and the education system, if those parts are being controlled, you have a lot of influence especially in influence on molding the next generation. And this is what you could say the baby boomers parts piece by piece conquered. And to this very day, those television as literature, as well as the educational systems, they are still being taught or still under heavy influence of of these first generation of baby boomers and their worldview, of course, and of course have a political connotation as well. I mean, the psychological self-understanding of baby boomers was, of course, they were deeply embedded in this Cold War philosophy, or this Cold War worldview. You have to be aware that there's some movies. I don't know. I've seen the last movies was from James Dean. I don't remember this name anymore, but and if you watch old movies from this area, from this baby boomer area, from this Cold War generation, then you see they work with psychological world, with philosophical world understandings. What is communism? What is capitalism? And what is a decent man? Whatever. I mean, this sounds from our perspective a bit ridiculous that someone invests so much time in wanting to differentiate between communist, between left and right. I mean, of course, to this very day they play a crucial role, but they really drove it to the extreme. You could say to this is a millennial obsession. Is of course religion. After 9/11, the interest of Islam grew, and now more than ever we invest a lot of time differentiating us from other religions and cultures, and even there's some ridiculous and rather videos or movies emerge which are a scathing indictment of the stupidity or of the mental state of my generation as well. So this is not something new. But it's in a way interesting to find these things among millennials as well. But of course, one of the baby boomer psychology was of course the threat of a constant nuclear war. I mean, the world came close to destruction. This thinking of the end of the world. So tomorrow you could be gone. And one thing that's somewhat interesting though, and this is partially among leftist millennials, was leftist baby boomers, and that they had some sort of a split personality in that sense that they would object to oppression. I mean, there are I mean, this is always difficult to translate this in English, but some sort of a laissez-faire education that this especially in some leftist circles, this was propagated, some sort of a laissez-faire education, so that you do not enhance your children's development and so enable them to develop freely, some sort of a Waldorf school. But then they would be against and despise any despotism, yes, but in the other hand, they would be very protective of the Soviet Union and would somehow even revere their accomplishments despite the fact of Stalinistic terror. And the Soviet Union was actually never, and this is very important, was actually never really a proletarian empire or a dictatorship. No, it was a dictatorship of bureaucrats, like you could comparable to ancient China, where eunuchs somehow controlled the bureaucracy and were corrupt and took advantage of the system. But this was indeed the case. So there was no proletarian dictatorship in the Soviet Union. Then the baby boomers in Europe, this was some sort of different to America, because it was different because of the Vietnam War and in America, as Americans know, the Vietnam War was actually the reason why there was no such a social welfare as it is common today in Europe, because the Vietnam War consumed a lot of money and resources. Lyndon Johnson wanted to introduce a lot of legislations, a lot of new developments. I mean, and he in the end did not succeed because of the war. The Vietnam War pretty much consumed it, and in a way depleted all these resources. Whereas in Europe there was some sort of a non-politicized welfare state. This is mostly called in Europe the post-Keynesian welfare state. This comes after John Maynard Keynes, who, roughly speaking, advocated that an government in economic crisis and downturn should create an artificial demand to stimulate the economy and keep the economy afloat. So this was a very crucial part of this economic self-sustaining. Of course, I mean, this is again what we said before, that why was communism successful in the Soviet Union, and it, as far as me concerned, communism was only success in the Soviet Union. It could only be successful there because of these resources. And again, this post-Keynesian welfare state was possible in Western Europe because, or one of the reasons was because the communist system was not integrated in the world system. Most of the companies would produce in the West and would sell and distribute their goods to their own people, so they would not, what is very common for today, produce abroad with cheap laborers and then sell their products here in the West, where of course they find buyers who pay in euro and dollars. Then another reason why this post-Keynesian welfare state worked was because back then there was pretty much mass employment, so, and people would have a job, so you would have a very secure job. This would mean when you start in a company as an apprentice or whatever, you would most certainly retire in this company. You would not have to fear cheap laborers abroad, or you don't have to fear that your company decides not to invest in the future of your company anymore, rather take the money and the stock market and speculate there. This is indeed a very big issue today. So how can you convince business owners to really invest in new technologies and in the development and research in new technologies, instead of parking their money in the stock market and watch them to grow? I mean, this has somehow became the easiest way of it, and there are a lot of scandals, of course. And then one thing was of course, the wages of workers rose in proportion to inflation and company profits. This is when the workers' union, you could say, somehow the workers' union found common ground with the business interest. Of course, you would somehow say that companies or business and business owners and entrepreneurs could not threaten the working class to move abroad, take their stuff and abroad. So the working union had more leverage over companies and business owners. So it was easier to come to a common ground. Then another reason why the post-Keynesian welfare state worked was, of course, that technological development was steadily, gradually, but if you compare it with today's smartphone age, it was rather slow and it was predictable. I mean, today's smartphone age this is rather accelerated. I mean, in my youth, the fastest personal computer was one which had 500 megahertz in Germany, and now this means nothing. So a lot of changes happened, and they happened very fast. So the world of baby boomers was rather predictable. You could expect things in a certain way. And you had some sort of feel of security. And what is of course important as well is the media. For millennials, the media is indeed very important, or has become the important social media. But you have to be aware that for baby boomers, the consumption of news and the media was a different one. Different in that sense that baby boomers, they were rather passive consumers of news, of entertainment, as well as newspapers, because back then the news channel or newspaper whatsoever would report news or give you the headlines, and you would somehow absorb them passively. But this is a whole lot different today with Twitter, Facebook. Now millennials, no matter whether it is fake news or real news, they can create their own news. Another example is back in the days, you had one photographer who would photograph scenes from war zones or whatsoever, or from protesters, and this would then be aired in the headlines. Now everyone with a smartphone can make photos of protests, of war zones whatsoever, and this is being immediately shared via internet. So millennials, they are, compared to baby boomers, way more active in producing news, and they as well as play a crucial part in spreading news. Think about the share button on all those social media sites. And of course, you have to be aware of one thing: the news media, they back in the days for baby boomers were somehow controlled in one central place. It had one central location. This was the news channel. This was the newspaper. And this made news somehow easier to control. I mean, this is one of the issues with today's Facebook, what should be controlled and what not, and some things, of course, have to be removed. But back then, for baby boomers, there were no question like whether one could control a news media whatsoever, because there were already through state intervention, things would be prevented and so on. I mean, today's millennial, generation, they have Google, and on a tip of their finger they can gather a lot of information in a short amount of period of time, whereas this was not.
It's finally time to start firing up the grill. From city to shore, Acme is everything you need to prep for this summer season. Download the Acme app to shop for this season's essentials any way you want. Open the Acme app, clip your deals, then order your items online. An experienced Acme associate will carefully select your groceries, bag your order, and bring it right to your car or deliver right to your door. Download the app or visit acmemarkets.com for program details.